The unthinkable discovery, a twist of fate. John Carver's life was a dream for most people. He had everything a man could want: a thriving career as a tech entrepreneur, a beautiful home nestled in the heart of the suburbs, and, of course, his beloved wife, Amelia. Together, they built what seemed like a perfect life. They had met in college, shared a love for travel, food, and adventure, and created a strong bond that made those around them envious. Their love was palpable, always evident in their eyes, the way they laughed together, and the way they held hands even after years of marriage. John worked tirelessly to provide for them, building a successful tech company that quickly gained recognition in the industry. His hard work had paid off. They had a spacious home, luxury cars, vacations to exotic places, and a circle of friends who often commented on how lucky they were to have found each other. Amelia, his constant companion, was his rock. She was beautiful, intelligent, and incredibly supportive. To everyone who knew them, they were the ideal couple. But as the months went by, John couldn't shake an unexplainable feeling. It wasn't anything specific, just an unease that settled into his chest. They were happy, weren't they? So why did he feel like something was missing? He had no logical reason to doubt Amelia. She had always been transparent, loving, and devoted. But there was something in the way she had been acting recently, small things, really. She had become more distant. More absorbed in her work. Less available for their regular weekend outings. At first, John chalked it up to stress from her side project, a new art exhibition she was preparing for, but deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if something else was at play. It was a feeling that John buried beneath the weight of his busy schedule. After all, who had time for doubts when life was moving so quickly? Amelia had always been his greatest supporter. Why would he doubt her now? It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything began to unravel. John had just returned from a week-long business trip to San Francisco. Exhausted but eager to see his wife, he entered their home, expecting to hear her voice calling out to him, like it always had in the past. He didn't hear anything. The silence was deafening. "Amelia?" John called out, stepping inside. There was no response. This wasn't normal. She always greeted him when he came home. He dropped his suitcase by the door, his mind racing with thoughts of where she could possibly be. Her car was parked in the driveway, and the lights were on in the house. He called her phone, but it rang through to voicemail. Concern began to rise in his chest. She must be out, John thought. Maybe she's at a friend's house, or maybe she's in her studio working on a painting. I'll give her some time. But something nagged at him. He was used to the feeling of anticipation when returning home from a trip, but today was different. His senses were heightened. He began walking through the house, searching for any sign of Amelia. As he approached the kitchen, his eyes fell on a small, velvet box sitting on the counter. It wasn't unusual for Amelia to leave things around the house, but this box, it didn't belong here. John hesitated for a moment before picking it up. His fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing a delicate silver necklace. Engraved on the pendant were the initials SR. His heart skipped a beat. He had never seen this necklace before. Amelia had never worn anything like this. Confusion flooded him as he gently set the box down. Who was SR? He couldn't think of anyone who would give Amelia something so personal. His mind raced, but there was no logical explanation. He needed to know more. Over the next few days, John tried to stay calm. He had no concrete reason to suspect anything. Maybe the necklace was a gift from an old friend, or perhaps it was something from her past. But there was a creeping sense of unease gnawing at him. He tried to reach out to Amelia, but she continued to avoid his calls and texts. Her absence didn't sit well with him. Something was wrong, and he could feel it deep in his bones. 2 days later, when Amelia finally returned home, John was there waiting. He tried to mask the growing anxiety in his chest, but it was impossible. When she stepped through the door, he barely recognized her. She looked thinner, her eyes tired, as though she hadn't slept in days. "Amelia," John began, his voice laced with concern, "where have you been?" She hesitated, her gaze falling to the ground. She didn't respond at first, and that silence felt like 1,000 heavy words unspoken. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. John's stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. He stepped closer, feeling the weight of the moment. I need to know what's going on, Amelia. I've been calling you, trying to reach you, and you've been avoiding me. Amelia bit her lip and then finally looked up, her eyes filled with guilt. I didn't mean to hurt you, John. I didn't know how to tell you. A pit formed in his stomach. John's pulse quickened. Tell me what? What's going on, Amelia? She paused, her eyes welling up with tears. John, I've been seeing someone else. His name is Sam Reed. I never intended for it to happen, but it did. I'm so sorry. John froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Amelia was having an affair? His mind struggled to process the truth. He thought of the necklace, the initials SR. They weren't just some random letters, they were the initials of the man who had taken his place in his wife's heart. How long? John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. About a year, she said quietly, her voice trembling. I didn't know what I was doing. I got caught up in it, and I didn't know how to get out. I never wanted to hurt you. I swear I didn't. John's world crumbled in that moment. Everything he had known, everything he had worked for, felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He tried to process her words, but the pain in his chest was unbearable. He took a step back, his breath shaky. The woman he had trusted, loved, and built his life with had betrayed him in the worst possible way. The days following Amelia's confession were a blur. John didn't know how to function. His thoughts were constantly clouded with anger, disbelief, and an aching sadness. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of Amelia and Sam, together, laughing, loving, while he had been left in the dark. He moved out of the house, staying with a close friend, but his mind never stopped racing. How could Amelia do this to him? How could she betray the love they had built over the years? He thought about all the moments they had shared, their wedding day, their trips to Europe, their late-night conversations. Every memory now felt tainted. But amid the pain and confusion, something began to shift in John. He couldn't stay stuck in this spiral of anger and heartbreak. He began seeing a therapist, someone who could help him unpack the overwhelming emotions that had consumed him. The sessions were difficult, often filled with tears, but John started to realize that while Amelia's betrayal was heartbreaking, it didn't have to define him. Slowly, he began to rebuild his life. He reconnected with old friends, ones he had lost touch with while consumed by his relationship with Amelia. He threw himself into his work, not as an escape, but as a means of rediscovering his purpose. He started exercising again, picking up hobbies he had abandoned, and focusing on taking care of himself. In time, the emotional fog began to lift. John realized that while his relationship with Amelia had ended, his life was far from over. He was capable of moving forward. Months later, Amelia reached out to John. She had gone through her own journey of self-discovery, and while she could never undo the pain she had caused, she wanted to apologize. She wanted closure. John agreed to meet her, but he was no longer the man he had been when they first confronted each other. He was stronger now, more self-aware. The man sitting across from Amelia was no longer her husband. He was someone who had healed, who had grown, and who had learned to forgive, not for her sake, but for his own. I'm sorry, John, Amelia said, her voice full of regret. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how much I've changed. How much I regret what I did. John looked at her, his eyes steady. I forgive you, Amelia. But I can't forget. I can't go back to who I was before. I've learned a lot about myself these past few months. I've learned that I'm strong enough to move on. We both need to move forward. You've hurt me deeply, but I won't let this define who I am. And I want the same for you. Amelia's eyes filled with tears, but there was a sense of peace in her. I understand, she said softly. I just hope you can find happiness again. I will, John replied with a faint smile. And so will you. After the breakup with Amelia, John's life was in turmoil. The first few months were the hardest. He was no longer the man who had been surrounded by the warmth of a loving home, a wife who had been his anchor. He wasn't used to this feeling of isolation, of waking up alone every morning, and yet he knew, deep down, that this was a necessary phase for him to go through. In those early days, John would find himself walking aimlessly through their house, remembering the times he and Amelia had spent there. It was in the kitchen, where they had shared countless meals, that he felt the most nostalgic. The dining table that had once been filled with laughter now stood empty. The photos of their vacations and milestones, once reminders of their perfect life, now seemed like painful symbols of his past. But as time passed, John began to find his footing again. He realized that while the physical space they had shared no longer felt like home, his mind and heart had the capacity to heal. With every passing day, he made an effort to fill his life with things that made him happy, things that made him feel alive again. He reconnected with old friends, people he hadn't seen in years. They reminded him of who he had been before he got lost in his relationship with Amelia. Friends like Ethan, who had always been a reliable companion, took John out for drinks, played golf, and introduced him to new people. It was through these interactions that John remembered the importance of friendship, something he had neglected in the throes of his marriage. He also returned to his hobbies, things he had once loved but had let slip away. He took up hiking again, an activity he and Amelia had enjoyed in the early years of their relationship, before life got too busy. He rediscovered his passion for cooking, something that always brought him peace. In the kitchen, chopping vegetables and preparing a meal, he found a meditative rhythm that helped quiet the storm of emotions in his mind. But perhaps the most significant change was the work he did with his therapist, Maria. At first, John had resisted the idea of therapy. He felt embarrassed, unsure if he could open up about his pain. But over time, he found that Maria was more than just a therapist, she was a guide, a person who helped him untangle the mess of feelings that he had pushed aside for so long. Through their sessions, John explored the deep, raw emotions that had shaped his response to Amelia's betrayal. He began to understand that his initial feelings of anger were rooted in fear of abandonment, fear of losing his sense of self, and fear of being unworthy of love. John, Maria had said during one of their sessions, "You're not defined by what Amelia did. Your worth doesn't come from someone else's actions. You are whole, you are worthy, and you are capable of finding happiness again." It was a revelation that stayed with him. It was not about forgiving Amelia to make her feel better. It was about forgiving himself for not seeing the signs earlier, for not trusting his instincts, and for allowing himself to be swept up in someone else's choices. Forgiveness, John realized, was about setting himself free. As the months passed, John's life began to take on a new rhythm. His work still thrived, but he no longer allowed it to consume him. He hired a team to take over some of the responsibilities he had shouldered alone, delegating tasks that once felt all-encompassing. He found joy in creating balance. He started reading books on personal growth and spirituality, subjects that had never seemed important before. One evening, while walking through the park, John bumped into an old acquaintance, Rachel, a fellow entrepreneur he had met years ago at a tech conference. Rachel had always been friendly, but their paths had never crossed much beyond professional circles. They exchanged pleasantries, catching up on life, and over time, the casual meetings became more frequent. Rachel was kind, intelligent, and shared many of John's interests. There was something calming about her presence, a softness that made John feel at ease. One afternoon, as they sat in a cozy cafe, sipping coffee, Rachel gently asked him how he was doing. "I'm okay," John replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's been a journey, but I'm getting there." Rachel nodded. "I can only imagine how hard it must be. Losing someone you love isn't something that happens overnight. But you know, John, I've always believed that things don't happen to us, they happen for us. Sometimes, the toughest moments in life are the ones that teach us the most about who we truly are." John looked at her, surprised by the depth of her words. He hadn't expected someone to say something so profound, especially not someone he hadn't known very well. But Rachel had a way of making him see the silver lining in things, of gently shifting his perspective in a way that felt refreshing. "Thank you, Rachel. I think you're right," he said, his voice softer now. It was during this time that John began to understand that, while Amelia's betrayal was one of the most painful experiences of his life, it had also been a catalyst for his growth. He had learned so much about himself in the process, about his values, his passions, and his capacity for resilience. He was becoming a man who didn't need to be defined by anyone else's actions. He was becoming the person he had always wanted to be: whole, independent, and capable of love, both for himself and others. One day, while going through some old boxes of personal items, John found something that he had forgotten about: an old letter from Amelia. It had been tucked away in a box of things they had collected during their travels together, and it was written before everything had gone wrong. Curious, he opened it. The letter was simple, filled with expressions of love and admiration. It spoke of dreams they had shared, promises they had made. In one paragraph, Amelia wrote, "John, I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you. You are my best friend, my greatest love, and my heart's true home. No matter what happens, you will always be the most important person in my life." John's heart tightened in his chest as he read the words. They were beautiful. They were the kind of words that had drawn him to Amelia in the first place. But now, they felt like a bittersweet reminder of everything that had been lost. Still, there was a sense of peace that came with reading the letter. It wasn't about the past anymore, it was about who he was becoming. He carefully placed the letter back in the box and closed it, realizing that part of his journey was about letting go of the past. Amelia had been a chapter in his life, but she was no longer the focus of his story. Months later, after everything had settled, Amelia reached out to John once more. It had been a long time since their last conversation, but she wanted to meet. She asked for closure, and John agreed. He had moved on in many ways, but he knew that this meeting, this final conversation, would be important. They met at a quiet cafe, the same place where John had met Rachel months before. Amelia looked different, hollow-eyed, exhausted, but still beautiful in the way that made John's heart ache for the woman he had once known so well. "John," she said softly, her voice breaking, "I've thought about you every single day. I never wanted to hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to see you. I needed you to know that I've changed. I've been working on myself, on understanding why I did what I did. And I'm sorry, from the bottom of my heart." John took a deep breath, his emotions raw but under control. "Amelia, I've forgiven you. But forgiveness doesn't change the past. What happened, happened. I won't pretend that it didn't hurt, but I've learned so much from it. I've grown. And now, I'm focusing on building a life that makes me happy." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I hope you find that happiness, John. You deserve it." And in that moment, John realized that he had already found that happiness. It wasn't in the past, and it wasn't in the person he had once loved. It was in himself. He was whole. He was free. And most importantly, he was ready to embrace the future. As John walked out of the cafe, he felt lighter than he had in months. He knew that his journey wasn't over, but he also knew that he had emerged from the darkness stronger, wiser, and more capable of living a fulfilling life. The man who had once been defined by his love for Amelia was now defined by his love for himself and his capacity to build a future, no matter what the past had thrown his way. Hey everyone, thank you for following John's story all the way to the end. Sometimes, life throws us the hardest challenges, but those challenges are what shape us into the people we are meant to become. Have you ever been through something that changed your life in a profound way? Please share your experiences with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories of personal growth and resilience. Stay strong, and always keep moving forward.